G'day guys, my name's Nick, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to replace the water pump on your Isuzu MU-X or D-Max. So let's get stuck into it. So the first thing we need to do is remove the front under tray. So we've just got a couple of 14mm bolts and two 17mm bolts on the back there. So for the next step we can remove the radiator cap, but before we do we just need to make sure that our vehicle is completely cold. So that means that we haven't driven the vehicle for at least 6 hours, so it's completely cooled down, and then we are safe to remove this radiator cap. So now I've got my drain tray under the vehicle. I'm going to drain all the coolant from the radiator. So up here is a little tap in the center of the radiator, and we'll just loosen that tap off until the coolant starts draining out. So while the coolant's draining, we'll just pull our engine cover off. We'll just pop it up under the front, under the sides, remove that. So now while the coolant's drained out, I can just close this tap on the radiator. Now I'm ready to remove the two 10mm bolts holding in the coolant reservoir, the overflow bottle here. Now we can remove the hose from the radiator spout, and we can also remove it from these little radiator brackets, and we can remove our overflow bottle. Now I'm ready to remove my top radiator hose. And now I'm ready to take the bottom radiator shroud off. So this is the fan shroud. So we're just going to take this part off. So you just push up on these little clips here and they should pop out. There goes one. And now there's two more on either side that we need to pop out as well. Now we can just remove the bottom part of the shroud from the vehicle. So we'll just feed it out here. There we go. And now we can remove the 10mm bolt holding the top of the shroud onto the radiator. The next thing we need to do is remove these little clips. So you just push down on the inside of them and you can pop them off the radiator like that. So that frees the top of the radiator, and same with this side. Just push down on that one and pop that off. And now I'm just going to loosen this intercooler pipe and move it out of the way. Just loosen off those clamps. And now we can just move that out of the way. Now if you ever do have any open piping like this, it's always a good idea to put a clean rag into the piping so you don't have any debris go into the turbocharger or into the intercooler. And now we can carry on with removing the fan shroud from the vehicle. So we'll just remove that up. It comes out of there nice and easily. Alrighty guys, so now for a little tip. So anybody working on the front of their engine with the radiator exposed like this is definitely at risk of damaging the radiator. So when we're removing components or playing with drive belts and pulleys and that sort of thing, there's always the risk of hitting the radiator and damaging one of the tubes and splitting it. So what I usually like to do is either put a piece of cardboard down there, so you can cut a piece of cardboard out with a razor blade, or one of these foam mats actually fits in there quite well. So I've just got a foam mat in there protecting the radiator, just so while doing this repair I'm not up for a radiator as well by accidentally damaging it. So now we've got that in there to protect the radiator, let's carry on with the repair. And now we're ready to remove the air conditioning belt. So we've just got a 14mm nut here and a 12mm bolt up here, which is the tensioner, and then we can loosen the tension off that belt. Now we've loosened off the tension on the belt, we can remove the drive belt from the vehicle. So with the fan shroud removed, it's super easy to get that belt off. Now looking down the front of the engine, we're just looking onto the front of the water pump here. You can see these 4 nuts which hold the fan onto the front of the water pump. So the best time to loosen these nuts is right now before we take the belt off. So there's some tension on there and it's not going to move around. So I'll just use my 10mm ratchet spanner and I'm just going to loosen off these bolts all around the water pump. So now we've loosened off the 4 fan nuts, what we're going to do is loosen off the tension on the alternator belt. So we've got a 14mm nut down here, and on top is a 12mm tensioner bolt. And now I'm going to remove the drive belt from the vehicle, just pop it off there, and we can feed it out. Spin the fan around. There it goes. Now I'm ready to take the nuts off the front fan here. So I'll just loosen those off again till they're finger tight. And then we can just remove those and wiggle the fan off. And now I can also remove the water pump pulley. And have a look at this, guys. This is on the back of the water pump pulley. So you can see all the coolant that's been spraying around in that pulley. So I've only seen a couple of drips on the ground, but you can see it must have been leaking for a while. So now you can see down onto the water pump here, and you can actually see the little dry stains underneath the pump here that I was seeing beneath. So you can see where it was running straight down here and along onto the plastic cover and down onto the under tray. So before I remove the old water pump, I always like to check that my part is correct and also where all my bolt holes are. So now I can start removing the water pump bolts and nuts. So they are all 12mm bolts and nuts. I'll loosen all those off. And I've just got my drain tray under there just to catch any coolant that will come out when I remove the water pump. So now I've removed the old water pump from the vehicle. You can see where it was leaking from, so just from the little weep hole here, on the bottom of the water pump. And that was obviously getting sprayed all around and dripping down. So good time to replace the water pump. So let's get stuck into cleaning up the block so we can install our new parts. So now it's time to clean up where the gasket sits. So what we need to do is remove all the old coolant with a rag. We just want to make sure that we're getting all of that coolant away so we don't compromise our new gasket. And also what we need to do is use a little bit of wet and dry sandpaper. So this is P360 sandpaper. We're just going to clean away any of that gasket material that's been left behind. So now that I've given this a really good clean up with my wet and dry sandpaper, I just need to blow out the holes. So I need to blow out these holes where the water pump bolts go to make sure there's no coolant in them. So I haven't got compressed air at home, so I'm just going to use my leaf blower. Now I'm just going to use a mirror and double check that I have removed all of the material from the old gasket before I go on to the next step. And I'm just letting the rag sit in there a little bit just to soak up some of that coolant. So I'm just going to let it sit for a couple of minutes, soak up the coolant, because the last thing I want is to put my new gasket on and then have a drip of coolant run through it, because that will compromise the seal. So we'll give it a couple of minutes and then we can move on to the next step. So now I've just got a little bit of brake cleaner on my rag. What I'm going to do is one final wipe around the gasket surface. So this will just remove any of that residual coolant left over and also dry the surface out nicely so it's ready for the new gasket. So now you can see just how clean I've got the block surface here where the gasket runs. So this is probably the most important part of the whole job, to ensure that this surface is perfectly clean and free from residual coolant. So now I've got that perfectly clean, we can carry on by fitting our new gasket. So now I've got my silicone ready. I just had to put a hole in the side of it because it's all blocked up. So I'll just run a little bead around it and I'm going to massage it around it with my fingers to make it nice and even. So I'll just put a bit on like that, and then you just work your way around with your fingers like this and sort of evenly spread that silicone over all of that gasket. And that means that it's going to seal up nicely. So you can see how that's evenly spread all over the gasket, and it means that when we put this on, it's not too thick. So it means that it's evenly spread out and we're going to get a nice seal on that gasket. Just feed it onto the two dowels. Just slide that in till it hits home and sticks onto the gasket surface. There you go, that's sitting there nicely. So in here you can see a tiny little drip of coolant about to run its way out, and what I want to do before I put the water pump on is just dry that up. So I'm not going to disturb the gasket, I'm just going to dry that little drip of coolant up, and that's going to give us a bit of extra time to get that water pump on. So now I'm ready to fit my new water pump to the vehicle. Just line up the dowels, slide it on like that. We want to hold pressure on this while we do up the nuts and bolts. So the reason is, if there's any coolant in behind there, that can potentially leak out if we're not quick enough in installing the water pump. And by keeping the pressure on the water pump, we ensure that we keep the seal on the gasket. Now we're going to tighten this down in a star pattern. We're going to start with the stud on the top, moving to the bolt directly underneath the water pump. And what this will ensure is that the water pump is tightened down evenly and my gasket will seal correctly. So now I've got the new water pump fitted and I've got this really nice bead of silicone sealant coming out from around the water pump. I know that my water pump is going to seal up perfectly. So I did have to swap over the studs from the old water pump, and that's a pretty easy process. You just put two nuts onto the stud and wind it out of the old water pump. Then you can transfer them over to the new water pump and take the nuts off and carry on the process. So I swapped all four of those studs over and now I'm ready to reassemble everything back onto the vehicle. Alright guys, so now it's time to reassemble all the parts back onto the vehicle, and I am going to breeze through this pretty quickly because it's basically the exact same steps you've just watched in the reverse order. Alrighty guys, so now I've got everything back together. Now it's time to fill the cooling system. Now because I've caught all my coolant in my little drain tray with measurements, I can check how much coolant I've drained out and make sure I put the exact same amount back in. So I did change the coolant in this vehicle probably about a year ago, so I'm going to reuse the coolant because it's in perfectly good condition. So just before I start the vehicle, I'm just going to have a bit of a look around the water pump and make sure there's no leaks. So while I'm in the vehicle, I'm just going to turn the heater on full. So that's going to open the heater taps and allow all the coolant through the heating system. And I'm also just going to keep a bit of an eye on my temperature here and wait till it gets up to the halfway point and see if I can get that extra little bit of coolant into the system. So now I've got all of my coolant back into the system. I'm just going to put the radiator cap back on. Okay guys, so now I've got the cooling system filled back up. Now it's time for a clean down and road test. So on my road test, I'm just going to watch the temperature gauge in the vehicle to make sure it doesn't overheat and that there's no issues. So when I bring it back, I can check under the vehicle for leaks and refit my under trays. Then it is a good idea to let the vehicle sit overnight and cool down completely and recheck the coolant level in the morning. So ideally you want your overflow bottle to be on the max level and you want your radiator to be completely full to the brim. So there you go guys, that is how you replace the water pump on your Isuzu MU-X or D-Max. Now if you did enjoy today's video, or if you learnt a couple of things about how a water pump is replaced, please give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for more 4-wheel driving, accessory fitting and maintenance videos. Cheers guys.